Hey guys, welcome to another episode of KLINGSPOR's Tech Talk. I'm Nick, and I'm excited to be here with you today to talk about router bits. A little while ago, we went down to the tech lab and we went through some of this stuff here, but what I want to do today is expand on the information you're going to see first, but let's check out this video. When it comes to router bits, there are three main things you want to consider: cut quality, longevity, and price. And as far as these three things are concerned, they will be a direct reflection of the materials that are used to make the router bit. KLINGSPOR's carbide tipped router bits begin with a hardened steel body. Where some of the cheaper router bits use weaker cast materials for the body of the bit, we do not compromise when it comes to quality. Our hardened steel router bits allow for tighter tolerances in the cut and balance of the bit, as well as increased strength and durability. Next, we can talk about the quality of the carbide from which the cutting edges are formed. C2 and C3 carbide is the grade of carbide that can maintain a sharp edge for a long time and still withstand the forces involved in the cutting process. The carbide is almost 2 times as thick as some of the cheaper bits on the market. This allows for more sharpening and a longer life. Although tungsten carbide is a very hard material, it can also be brittle. So having carbide tips with minimal cheaper fillers is very important to us. Our carbide is some of the best in the industry. The brazing process by which the carbide is joined to the hardened steel body utilizes a compound that is 50% pure silver. This creates a bond that has never been known to fail. Our carbide tipped bits undergo precision tuning and balancing so they run smoothly. And then, before they leave the manufacturing facility, they are tested to ensure that they meet our quality standard. KLINGSPOR's solid carbide spiral bits undergo the same scrutiny when it comes to quality manufacturing and testing. They begin with a solid blank of high quality carbide. The flutes or cutting edges and gullets are milled to very precise specifications using computer controlled mills. This, in combination with tried and tested cutting edge geometry, provides a premium quality cutting tool that's second to none. The chroma and zircon coatings that are added to some of our solid carbide spirals are nano-ceramic coatings that strengthen the bit, harden the cutting edges, and cut down on the amount of heat that's generated in the cutting process. These features lengthen the life of the bit to 2 to 3 times that of the uncoated spiral bit. KLINGSPOR router bits provide quality at a very competitive price. To get yours today, contact our Customer Relations Department at 1-800-645-5555 or contact your local factory sales representative. So having seen all that, the question comes to mind: what is it that separates a quality industrial style router bit from like a cheap beginner router bit that you might get at one of the local box stores? That's a question I've been asked a pretty good number of times. And there are basically three main things that go into a quality industrial style router bit. Of course, the first one being quality materials. When these router bits are made, they're made with top quality materials. And you'll see that as we go through this list of information I have here. But that's the first and most important thing, is you have to start with quality materials. The second thing you'll see, if you were to go to the manufacturing facility, you would see the precise manufacturing standards that come into play when making these router bits, with balancing and making sure that everything is exactly as it's supposed to be. And then, of course, the last step of that process is tuning and testing. You can be assured that every time a router bit leaves the manufacturing facility, it's been tuned and it's been tested. Exactly what does that mean? Well, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But first, let's look at some of these quality materials that I mentioned earlier. To start off with, you have to look at the carbide. The carbide is the material that creates the cutting edge. Carbide grading is from C1 to C14. Now, where a lot of people mistake here is they begin to think that that rating is based on the quality of the carbide, but it's actually not. C1 to C14 comes into play because of a sliding scale that's in place. That scale, to one side, has hardness, okay? And to the other side has impact resistance. Now, C1 to C14 doesn't so much indicate quality as it indicates what that particular grade of carbide is best suited for. So C1 to C14. Now, when we talk about KLINGSPOR router bits, we're talking C2 and C3 grade carbide. That is exactly the proper point for carbide that can handle the pressures that these router bits come under, but at the same time have enough hardness that it can maintain a cutting edge. And another thing about this carbide is it's what's considered micro grain. What does that mean? Let me explain it to you this way. Cast iron has a very big grain. Now when we talk about metal grain, what you want to picture in your mind is basically a honeycomb, okay? Each one of those little cells in that honeycomb, as far as carbide is concerned, is a little crystal, okay? And as big or as small as those crystals are will help to determine exactly what that carbide is suited for, how good that carbide is. If you've ever watched the television show Forged in Fire, for instance, they make these knives, they put them through rigorous testing, and during the testing, every now and then, they'll break a knife. The very first thing they'll do is they'll pick both ends of that broken knife up and look at it to see how big the grain is in that steel. The larger grain does not handle impacts well. The smaller grain, as you would imagine, handles impacts very well, but at the same time, you can get a keen, sharp cutting edge on that smaller grain. It's the same way with carbide. The smaller the grain, as far as cutting is concerned, the better off you're going to be. So this here is micro grain carbide. Very, very good stuff. Another cool thing about the carbide is it has minimal cheap fillers. What that means is, I mentioned the little crystals of carbide. Well, every now and then between these crystals of carbide there will be a little gap, and those have to be filled in to make a solid material. The carbide grade that we use here at KLINGSPOR is one of the highest quality in the country. Some of the router bits you get from, for instance, like China and places like that might have a lot of the fillers in there. Now, will the router bit cut? Yes, but it won't last as long. It's more prone to chipping and breakage and things like that. The second thing we have to talk about, other than the carbide grading, is the steel that these router bit bodies are made from. Now, there are two basic types out there in the market. There is a hardened steel body, which this is right here, and there is a cast body. You might ask, what's the difference? Well, let's look at it this way. And this is a kind of an extreme example, but you'll get the idea. If you take a cast iron frying pan in your left hand and a hammer in your right hand, and you smack that cast iron frying pan, what's going to happen? It's not going to dent, it's not going to bend, it's going to break. Why? Because, like we talked about earlier, the carbide, the cells of the carbide are a lot, or cells of the metal are a lot bigger. And with that bigger cell, it's not going to be as strong. So there again, we're at micro grain. It's the same way with the solid steel that we use for the router bit bodies. Cast material has that larger grain, is just not going to hold up as well. Some of the cheaper router bits you'll find out there will be made from the cast material. The whole process goes as follows. We start out with a hardened steel bar, just like this right here. And you can see, if you look closely at this display, it goes through the process. It's slowly milled down. Carbide, solid carbide, is brazed onto the edges. And it's interesting, the brazing process, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it gets brazed on, the carbide is sharpened, it's tuned, it's tested, and then finally the bearing post is milled and the bearing is installed. So what is brazing? Brazing is basically this. You take two metal materials and you heat them both up to the point to where they're just about melting but not quite. At that point, the grain of the metal actually swells up and creates little voids or little spaces in between each one of those grains. Then at that point we introduce a brazing compound, and in this case the brazing compound is 50% pure silver. We could do it a lot cheaper, but the quality wouldn't be up to what we want. So we use the 50% pure silver brazing compound. And what happens is, with those hot metals, that brazing compound seeps into all the little cracks and between all the little grains and virtually bonds those two pieces of metal together. I have worked with router bits for 20, 30 years, and I have never seen a piece of carbide completely come loose from a steel router bit and come off. It just doesn't happen. You can get them, you can dull them, you can chip them, things like that, but they just don't come loose. That brazing compound does its job so well. And so it creates a metallurgical bond between the filler metal and the work pieces. And that's a bond that's just primarily unbreakable. All right? And then we've got several different types of router bits. We have carbide tipped router bits, which is what you'll see here. It's a solid steel body with a carbide tip brazed into place. But then we've got solid carbide spiral router bits. And the difference between these two is, if you look closely at this bit, you'll see it has straight pieces of carbide. Okay? That is actually a straight piece of carbide, that the edge has been honed to a certain shape. with a solid carbide spiral router bit, the cutting edges spiral around the outside of the bit, okay? It's a solid piece of carbide, and the cutting edges are milled right directly into that solid piece of carbide. So the advantage, when this bit goes through its cutting process, you've got a piece of carbide entering the workpiece and exiting the workpiece. And then the next piece of carbide comes around and it's entering the workpiece and exiting the workpiece. During this process, there's some vibration that occurs. With a solid carbide spiral, you don't get that vibration because that cutting edge spirals around the base of that router bit, and it's in cutting the workpiece the entire time. Very important point there. So you get several things out of a solid carbide spiral that you won't get out of a carbide tipped bit. Number one, you're going to get a longer life. Number two, you're going to get a much cleaner cut edge because it's actually shearing the material. And number three, there's going to be a lot less heat generated, which again is going to add to the lifetime of that router bit. I have never known one of the KLINGSPOR router bits, one of the pieces of carbide to come off, and the only disadvantage you have to the solid carbide spirals is the fact that if your feeds and your speeds aren't set properly, you could conceivably break that router bit off. But we have a computation that you can do that will actually give you a good starting point for your feeds and speeds, so that's not an issue either. We do have router bits that have coatings on them, nano-ceramic coatings, that increase the life of the router bit from anywhere to 2 to 3 times the life of an uncoated router bit. All right, guys, that's about all I have for today. Thank you for joining us here at KLINGSPOR's Tech Talk. If you do have any questions or comments or concerns, anything like that, feel free to email us at techtalk@klingspor.com. I'm Nick. Have a great day.